Thank you very much. Thank you, Brendan, for the kind words of introduction. Thank you. I just want to thank everyone at the Charles Redd Center, Dr. Rensing, Dr. Cannon, Amy Carlin, who helped make the arrangements. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here, and how grateful I am for the support that the center has offered for this work and also for previous work. I was a recipient of a Charles Redd grant when I was doing my master's research at the University of Calgary. So the money that the center gave me helped me spend a summer in Montana and really started me down this road many, many years ago. So the center is got such a great reputation for the work it does in promoting the history of the West. It's a great honor to be here and to be able to talk to you students and scholars of Western history about some of my work, some of the work that's kept me pretty busy over the past few years. I thought I'd start today's talk with reference to a series of events that would be very, very familiar to students of Western history. One of the marquee events is that of the Plains Wars of the 1860s and 1870s. You know, we all know them as students of Western histories as these painful, bloody episodes of conquest and wars of conquest and incorporation that you know are so very important to the history of the West, to the history of its indigenous peoples, but also that make their way into American histories, that even the most casual students of American history have heard of such events. And the best histories, whether at the national scale or at the regional scale, when they're talking about these Plains Wars, do their job, the work of showing the urgency of these kinds of events. But throughout the 1870s, a series of newspapers in Montana began to publish a series of reports to their readers that reminds us of an overlooked front in these conflicts, the Plains Indian Wars of the 1860s and 70s. And that front was the 49th parallel, the border between the US and Canada west of the Great Lakes. In November, or in the early 1870s, newspapers like the Helena Weekly Herald reported in the excerpt that you can see here with some satisfaction about a successful army raid by a detachment of the US Army on a camp of Plains Métis traders. This colony of British nomads, the Montana newspaper explained, had brought with them large quantities of liquor and ammunition to barter with the Indians for robes and peltries. These sorts of interactions, the newspaper went on to claim, were part of a broader campaign by these traders to encourage indigenous peoples in the United States to make war, in their words, to make war upon the government of the United States and its citizens. The circumstances alluded to in this newspaper article and in a bunch of others that were published around the same time in Montana were part of a disturbing series of reports that made their way from the west to the east in the early 1870s, describing a disturbed state of affairs along this stretch of the border, which now marks the border between Montana and the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. Reports such as these introduced the Métis, a group that I'll be talking about today, to U.S. officials and to the U.S. public, and underscored just how important it was to suppress these cross-border networks that these Métis traders had established if the U.S. was to secure its northern border. In this view from the north is important, and I start with it today. In order to remind us that the violence that flared up across the plains in the 1860s and 70s, the violence that is part of standard stories of Western history, wasn't contained by the political boundaries that were marked across the 49th parallel. And in the pitched battles that erupted between U.S. troops and indigenous peoples across the northern plains during the Civil War and its aftermath, U.S. officials came to view these trading networks and the Métis traders who supplied arms, ammunition, and other goods to indigenous peoples in the U.S. as impediments to American expansion. In fact, if we take a closer look at these trade networks, these cross-border trade networks, and the interactions between indigenous peoples on this stretch of the northwest of the border, we can see these events as part of a larger process of marking and enforcing the 49th parallel and of dividing Indigenous homelands, processes that in fact hinged on the actions and intentions of Indigenous peoples themselves. And what I mean by that is that, in an important sense, the actions of the Métis traders and their Indigenous clients and partners were important in shaping how how American officials viewed the borderlands, the kind of vision they got of that region, their impression of the region, their information of it, and their actions prompted sharp reactions on the part of the army. On both sides of the border, Métis actions drove and shaped federal action. So in an attempt, what I'm going to do for you today is to try and recast some of these stories, first of all by situating the events that I'll be talking about within this larger set of stories about Western history, but also to invert some of the expectations in those more familiar stories where Indigenous peoples are always reacting and really are these are their homelands being divided and appropriated. But I want to suggest to you some other ways that we can look at that process. Which brings me to the subtitle of today's talk, the Researching and Writing Transnational Histories of Plains Indigenous Peoples. And so it's worth pausing, I think, before I get into the substance of the talk, to think about what the stakes are of this kind of work, because you may have encountered this in your class, and the more you read Western histories these days, the more you're likely to encounter people who are peddling stories that are transnational and selling the virtues of such stories. And those of us who are engaged in this kind of work see it at its most basic as an effort to write a kind of connective histories across boundaries. That in telling stories that follow subjects, mobile subjects, as most Plains Indigenous peoples were, historians who want to investigate their stories have to be mobile as well. So you have to follow your subjects. And in this case, for the groups that I'll be talking about, that means crossing the border between Canada and the United States repeatedly, following the lifelong journeys of these mobile peoples. And in so doing, using those journeys to write a kind of connective history that spans national boundaries. Perhaps more importantly, those stories those connective stories should actually help us rethink some of the other more familiar narratives that we encounter. The more familiar stories, whether it's in Canada or the United States, in the regional histories of the North American West. Because most of these, for a long time, most of these stories have typically viewed these events from the perspective of their own sort of national frameworks, and have interpreted events in the Indigenous histories of the Plains in ways that are meant to shine an interesting light on stories that are of importance, say, to American historians or Canadian historians. Right? We see the effects, for example, in Canada. Even the most casual student of Canadian history will encounter the history of the Métis, people I'll introduce to you in just a second. Because in 1869, a group of Métis nationalists under the leadership of Louis Riel led an armed resistance that stopped Canada's acquisition of its West and forced the Canadian government to negotiate with the Métis to recognize their Métis Aboriginal title. It's the kind of story that makes its way into every Canadian history book. But in that context, Métis history emerges only at those moments when it matters to Canadian history writ large. Once 1870 is resolved, then historians look elsewhere and they tell other stories, partly by necessity. So that recognition and that connection, that close connection to these national stories, means that the histories of the Métis are often viewed only in those instances and interpreted in those ways that matter in relation to those national stories. The same is true, I think, in the United States with the histories of Indigenous histories more generally, that the tendency to link or to bound these stories geographically within the territorial boundaries of the United States, and temporally with the notion of the frontier, erects a kind of predictable set of boundaries around these stories, such that we don't see in these histories those moments when Indigenous peoples cross borders into Mexico or into Canada, or how they continue to matter, and their actions continue to matter after the closing of the frontier or after the period of border marking. The problem then, and so some of the problems with this kind of approach, is that what that allows us to do is to overlook the fact that in this part of the world, in northwestern North America, that Indigenous peoples remained very much in control of their territories through much of the 19th century. They remained the dominant economic, political, military powers, and they exerted very real power on the abilities of the Canadian government in particular, but also the US government to lay claim to portions of northwestern North America. It's something that's certainly more pronounced in Canada than in the United States, but it holds in the northern reaches of American territory as well. When we overlook that, and when we rely too closely on these sort of usual frames for narrating these stories, we tend to tell stories that offer neat narrative turning points and points of closure that confirm stories of colonization, right? And that consign Indigenous histories to reactive roles as internal subjects within new nation states, right? That's one of the cumulative effects of these kinds of narrative techniques, right? By declaring the story over with the closing of the frontier or with the end of border marking, historians have helped sever Indigenous pasts from Indigenous presence. And so by restoring a measure of contingency to these history, scholars, I think, are trying to chip away at the sense of inevitability that so often inflects many of these stories of Western expansion, whether in Canada or the United States, and to continue to see Indigenous peoples as actors in the national era. So let me tell you a little bit, I'll give you some background on the time and place that I'm talking about, beginning with the Métis. So as a testament in some ways to the success of those nation-making projects of the 19th century and the efforts to sort of partition the plains, that the Métis in the United States require introduction, even though their homelands it included much of North Dakota, Montana, and parts of the northern plains. The Métis, for those of you who have not encountered them, are a post-contact Indigenous people. That is to say, a people whose patterns of ethnogenesis, of emergence as a new people, emerged in about the late 18th, early 19th century, often in close connection with fur trades. These were peoples who emerged amid those large displacements in the interior of North America that you've no doubt encountered elsewhere. The introduction of epidemic disease, of metallic weaponry, of horses, of Europeans eventually, of other trade goods that created a cascading series of consequences that really transformed the lives of all Indigenous peoples in places like the Great Plains. And on those northern reaches of those plains, those conditions helped give rise to a new people, often in close connection with the fur trade worlds that were created as Europeans, primarily French Canadians and Scottish, established posts in the interior of North America and established marital relations with Indigenous women, primarily Cree, Assiniboine, and Ojibwa. And out of these beginnings, the Métis emerged as over the course of the 19th century, a distinct nation marked by a distinctive language, distinctive dress, distinctive artistic traditions, bardic traditions, and religious practices, along with very expansive kinship networks that over time consolidated a Métis nation that was linked to that of their Indigenous neighbors and kin, but that was increasingly distinct. Importantly, what propelled those the growth of this nation and their movement onto the plains, as you see here from this photo taken in northern Montana, were the economics of the fur trade and later the buffalo and provisions trade. That their economic clout, they were able to carve out an economic niche for themselves as traders par excellence, particularly of buffalo products, and to take advantage of the expanding commercial demand for furs and for buffalo meat, hides, and robes. And they used that to become one of the most formidable nations on the northern plains and remain a very vital part of the Canadian social landscape and political landscape to this day. During the middle decades of the 19th century, these kinds of commercial networks ran through the borderland world of the northern plains. I will give you a map here, give you a sense of sort of those early clusters of Métis settlement, particularly on the parkland fringe of the northern plains, and then the sense of the migrations that took more and more people onto the plains into the area that we'll be talking mostly about today. Those trade networks that I opened with today grew out of the dynamics of this mobile hunting and trading society tied to the buffalo. The trade economics propelled the formation of the first Métis communities and really were the sort of impetus behind their expansion. And behind that was really an insatiable demand for buffalo meat, particularly by the Hudson's Bay Company, that massive British commercial entity based in Fort Garry, which you see there, or based in London really, but had a North American outpost in Fort Garry, and an outlet that depended on buffalo meat in order to fuel its trade brigades and its distant fur trade posts, very lucrative trading opportunities in the far north, in the boreal forests of northern Canada, places that were rich in furs but very poor in food. And so buffalo meat, and dried buffalo meat in particular, and pemmican, which is dried buffalo meat pounded with fat and berries, is a dense, long-lasting, energy-rich form of food that became absolutely essential to sustaining the British trade presence in the north, a presence that generated a lot of money for them. And for that reason, the Hudson's Bay Company came to rely on these mobile Métis hunting brigades in order to supply the meat, to hunt and then produce the meat that would sustain fur trade operations. And that insatiable demand created tremendous economic opportunities that drove the expansion of Plains Métis communities. And beginning in the 1830s and 40s, that demand was further augmented by the arrival of American traders, moving up the Missouri River onto the northern plains. And these folks were interested in meat as well, but also increasingly robes and hides and the like. So by mid-century, the Métis producers had the possibility of trading into two different and competing economic networks, a situation that boosted their economic power, and that also allowed them to trade meat north into the British system and robes and hides south into the American system. So from their inception, these Métis networks were transnational, and they were wound quite closely around the 49th parallel. It's in the context of these buffalo hunting communities, and some of you may have had the chance to read that short article by Maria Campbell in which she describes the buffalo hunt and its importance as an incubator of Plains Métis culture and society. You see here from this illustration from Harper's, the women who are in the role that they took on in camps in terms of sustaining these communities. The women in these camps in these communities were essential in terms of stitching together through marital relations and through the kinds of family connections, these vast mobile communities that covered, as you can tell from the map, large stretches of the plains. And it was really important when these groups were venturing onto the plains that they did so they moved through territories that at times could be hostile or could be, these are lands claimed by other indigenous peoples. And so the fact that the Métis could trace ancestry, or they had kin connections into many different indigenous communities on the West, made this kind of mobile community possible. Now, these were multicultural brigades in which people had Cree relatives or Ojibwe relatives or Assiniboine relatives. They spoke multiple languages. They had the cultural expertise that came with that, and they had the political wherewithal to negotiate passage through these different territories. These were vital to sustaining life on the plains. By the 1870s, the focal point for these communities was on the region that you see here on this map, a place that I'll call the northwestern borderlands, a place that by the 1870s was home to some of the largest remaining buffalo herds on the northern plains. By the 1870s, the herds in the north had contracted so much that it was very difficult for Indigenous peoples in Canada to continue to hunt buffalo without moving south. So by the 1870s, a cluster of dots that you see there were Métis settlements. But you can imagine that those migrations were accompanied by the southward migrations of many other Indigenous peoples as well, all in pursuit of buffalo. And I should add, in pursuit of the lucrative trade opportunities that existed there because of the traders who, of course, followed the hunters. What you also see from this map here, particularly on the southern side, or just south of the border, are a series of other lines that testified to the growing American federal presence in this part of the world in the 1870s. You see in the dark shaded region there, land that has been set aside as an Indian reservation that in the early 1870s spanned the entire northern reaches of Montana, and as well as some of the roads and other kinds of infrastructure that were created quickly in the aftermath of the mineral rushes that brought so many outsiders to Montana in the 1860s. What this map also suggests is that the border also marked a fundamentally different position north of the border, that there was a fundamental asymmetry that existed here. Whereas the United States was busy in terms of setting up its Indian agencies, surveying railroads, constructing roads, building towns, the presence in Canada of the Canadian state, for example, was almost invisible. That before 1874, the Canadian government had no police and no army presence west of Manitoba, so in that region that you see there. And after 1874, the administration of Canadian laws in the region was left to a couple dozen mounted police officers, which created a fundamental difference in the presence of the state and the power of the state, and helped further propel the growth of these trade networks that I began this talk with. There was, in some sense, a power vacuum north of the border that allowed traders to exploit the kinds of jurisdictional differences, the fact that there were laws that were in existence on one side of the border and not the other, and use the border as a shield, right? Traders who could provision themselves in Canada, buying arms, ammunition, alcohol, and the like, cross the border and trade on the Indian reservation where that trade was illegal, and then quickly cross the border again if they were in danger of being pursued. That kind of asymmetry was fundamental to really the history of this region. You see how in that region that we're talking about, really the landscape was rugged, difficult to traverse, which actually added extra incentive in some ways for people looking to escape the law. For example, that kind of asymmetry was really a long-standing part of the history of this region and gave rise to a particular set of dynamics, one that became into view with each sort of successive conflict between different Plains peoples and American authorities. In the 1860s, for example, when Dakota bands fled Minnesota in the aftermath of the Minnesota Uprising of 1862, military commanders who took to the plains in order to capture those Dakotas repeatedly wrote to their superiors in the army suggesting that Métis traders were not only supplying the Dakotas with the arms that they needed to resist the American army, but that they were also feeding them the information in order that the Dakotas could stay one step ahead of the army. And that gave rise to what you see here, the notice that was printed in a newspaper in Fort Garry, present-day Winnipeg, from carrying President Lincoln's name, trying to warn off hunters, saying that if you were found, or traders I should say, if you were found south of the border engaging in this kind of traffic, you would be tried by court-martial and punished duly. It was, and these kinds of references recur throughout the archival documents of this time period, suggesting that Métis traders were traveling as far down as the Platte River on the Central Plains and feeding arms and ammunition to the Cheyenne. And when the Lakotas, Cheyenne, and Arapaho struck at surveyors sent to plot the route of the Northern Pacific Railroad in 1872 and 73, officials again pointed to Métis borderland traders as the likely source of the arms and the ammunition. And those accusations only intensified after 1876 with the defeat of the U.S. Army at the Little Bighorn and with the flight of thousands of Lakotas north of the border into Canada, where they remained. In the years between 1876 and 1881, the focus on this border reached its most intense and in fact gave rise to repeated and growing military campaigns launched by the U.S. Army in order to forcibly expel Métis and other groups they identified as foreign Indians who crossed the border into the U.S. to hunt the last remaining buffalo on the plains. You see this slide from Fort Assiniboine in Montana. Fort Assiniboine, one of the last army posts to be constructed on the northern plains, is now in Montana. And you know, there is beginning in 1870, the U.S. Army constructed a string of posts all the way just south of the border, really in parallel with that, in part to deal with these challenges of northerners crossing the border, both to hunt and to trade. Throughout this period, then, the intelligence that reached American officials raised the disturbing possibility that the illegal trade in arms and ammunition by the Métis strengthened the hand of those Plains nations who were most determined to resist American expansion. And that's in part what explains the intense focus on this region. This shared wariness about the Métis presence put the spotlight on this region and more precisely on the kinds of arrangements that underpinned it, the day-to-day interactions between the Métis and their neighbors. And these concerns drove federal policies and actions, though often in unexpected ways. The day-to-day interactions between Métis and their traders and their clients were really put under the microscope, as were the kinds of understandings that allowed the Métis to sort of exist in this really volatile environment. And it's actually including the relationships that allowed the Métis to cultivate those very important relationships with Dakotas and Lakotas. It's not insignificant. For the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, Métis and Dakotas clashed repeatedly over and over again as Métis buffalo hunters went south and hunted buffalo in Dakota territories. And that led to repeated clashes and repeated sort of efforts to stitch together truces, according to Dakota custom, that had to be renewed every year, that proved very fragile and often devolved into bloodshed. But the outbreak of war in the 1860s between the Dakotas and the United States recalibrated those relations and meant that the Dakotas and the Métis were able to patch up those relations. Dakotas understood that those Métis traders were their only conduit for guns and ammunition, the very things that they needed to continue to hunt and also to defend themselves. These inter-indigenous political understandings that were negotiated on the ground, face-to-face in these borderland communities, became very vital to distant officials in the 1870s. Right? People in Washington cared very deeply about these very micro events hatched on this distant frontier, because understanding them and disrupting them became so vital to these larger national projects of establishing the border and consolidating American claims to the region. In light of the ongoing conflicts between the United States and the Dakotas and the Lakotas, the political prerogatives of Indigenous actors mattered deeply. That these kinds of understandings that they reached, the actions that they took, were very important, and important in determining how policymakers then calibrated their actions. While states constructed political borders over top of Indigenous territories, Indigenous leaders continued to negotiate their own boundaries with one another and their relations with new nation states. And surprisingly, during this time period, in many ways, that federal efforts to consolidate their borders actually depended on these Indigenous political actions. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. We can see that a little bit when we look at in Canada, the actions of the Northwest Boundary Commission, which you see some of the photographs that I've been using were taken during the 1870s, and the joint commission struck by Great Britain, Canada, and the United States to survey the length of the 49th parallel to the Rocky Mountains. It was a moment when the survey hit the ground at a moment, in the midst of these sort of very volatile political events. And in order to navigate those political events, British officials turned to the Métis, and in fact hired Métis as emissaries who went in advance of the surveyors in order to seek the consent of different Indigenous nations to pass through their territories, and to brief them about the Canadian government's plans to send police in the following years. The guides that were contracted to take the surveyors west, the roads that they traveled, all of those things were in fact Métis. Métis guides. They followed pathways that had been blazed by Métis traders and hunters in previous years. And the information they received along the way was often obtained from these same people, that the Métis were the ones, because of their facility in French and English, were often the ones who were the intermediaries and who fed the information that allowed distant federal officials to actually see and understand this place. The critical assistance Métis individuals offered in connection with the boundary survey was part of a larger pattern of whereby Métis informants and other intermediaries were critical in this information and the information that they supplied, and in shaping how people actually saw the borderlands. So in this sense, then, we can see, in some ways, the two sides of that coin, how the danger posed by independent Indigenous peoples heightened federal awareness of this region and drove policies in that way, but we can also see how there was a tremendous dependence at the same time on these same people for material support in executing things such as the boundary survey, but also in just gathering intelligence about this region and its peoples. So let me just wrap this up here. The interactions between the Métis and their neighbors, though rooted in local matters, acquired a new significance for federal actors who were charged with overseeing this region. Those actions, the way that those interactions might be a source of consternation or comfort, but they were integral to shaping the way that federal actors in both Canada and the US understood the borderlands. In the United States, the creation of Montana Territory in 1864, the organization of Indian agencies, and the intensification of violence between the U.S. Army and Lakotas thrust Métis borderland trade networks into view. Métis traders came into conflict with U.S. federal officials who were convinced that those traders were fundamentally to blame for sustaining Lakota resistance and Lakota military actions against the American army. Such circumstances would give rise to repeated raids through the 1870s as U.S. law enforcement officials set their sights on these Métis settlements, and later would give rise to full-fledged military campaigns to expel First Nations from the north across the 49th parallel. These actions remind us how these distant settlements on these very remote fringes of the United States were very closely linked to the central imperatives of U.S. expansion. Right? That part of the concern was that problems here would disrupt things like the Railroad Survey, would disrupt long-term settlement plans, and the resettlement of the North American West. The weakness of Canadian claims actually meant that these concerns were even more heightened in Canada. The potential for unrest along the border threatened Canada's very hold on its western territories and further magnified the significance of Indigenous political actions. The absence of effective measures to suppress the illicit trade across the border, to diffuse military threats, or even to assess them independently. The fact that the Canadian government could not do this on its own put the spotlight on the exchanges and other arrangements, highlighting their very dependence on the people they were supposed to monitor. At the same time, Métis actions invested the border with meaning. The more obvious federal presence in the 1870s and the heightened attention to the international border began to exert pressure on these same communities. Plains Métis communities that were the targets of these military operations well understood that violence was essential to the creation and enforcement of the northern boundary of the United States. The violence that exploded across the plains in the 1860s and 1870s was not contained by the political boundaries like the 49th parallel. Indeed, the conflict unleashed by the clashes between the U.S. Army and Indigenous peoples was pivotal in making that boundary real. Thank you. So I hope that wasn't too inside baseball and in too great of detail for you, but I'm happy to answer questions. I have a few minutes before some of you have to wander off to other classes, but if some of the material that I ran through requires further illustration or elaboration, or if you have other questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Yes?
I'm interested in this concept of narration in history.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about what kind of happens when we use openings and closings of time periods and of Indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe just explain that a little bit more?
Sure.
What your method of approach was in studying that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I think that one of the principal advantages of doing the kind of work where you bring different sort of national historiographies into dialogue with one another, history has always been sort of very closely tied to the nation, and national histories have sort of been the normative frame, the way that we think about the past. And often we come to take those things for granted, and we do that because we keep encountering particular historical stories in school and as we progress, and things become very familiar. And one of the things that we start to internalize are the kinds of the timelines and turning points on those timelines. And what was interesting for me, for example, as someone who went to school in Canada, raised in the Canadian education system, seeing dates that were of really central importance in Canadian history, like 1869 or 1870, the year when Canada purchases the Hudson's Bay Company claims and acquires the West, the year of the Red River Resistance. So important, not just for this study, but for any story that tries to tell how Canada came into being, that those dates have absolutely no meaning south of the border, right? And same thing with for example, the Civil War, which is sort of the pivotal watershed in 19th century American history. Canadian historians, that emerges only tangentially insofar as it helps explain why the colonies of British North America chose to join into a larger confederation in 1867. So what that meant in Western places, for example, it's not even on the radar, even though if you look at the sources, you can see that in the newspapers of the time, in correspondence, that people are remarking on events in Civil War battlefields, they're remarking on events in Minnesota, all these sorts of things, that these connections existed, but they're sacrificed often in the stories that people have later told about them, right? That in order to fit the stories we tell into the containers that make sense to our audience, the presses, our readers, our students, we often sort of have to leave aside those things that seem tangential, right? And we fall into those well-established narrative patterns that have the same kinds of markers, right? And we begin to take them for granted. So I think that the advantage of projects that force you to engage with different historians and different histories who don't use the same assumptions as you is really healthy, because you say, well, was that really a turning point? Are there other turning points? Or how are these events that are so pivotal here and described in such great detail here, how are they affected, or how are they felt on this side of the border? Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like the people, your colleagues that you work with, are they willing to open up and read your material even though it doesn't fit certain narratives?
Yeah.
Or is there a closed-off section of historians that say, stick with our narrative?
No, I think that people are open. I think that certainly I think that there's a great willingness and openness. What I'm doing here is no longer all that novel. There's a great many people who, Dr. Rensink, for example, who are engaged in similar kinds of inquiries, and I think a lot of interest in this. And part of the reason that people were interested in this project was precisely because it crossed borders. So I took this project, for example, to an American press, which in some ways is hard, right, in the sense that you have to pitch a project about people and places that aren't not on the radar generally, but there was a willingness or an interest because of the treatment of a topic, the treatment of the topic which sort of crosses borders. And so yeah, I'd say people are willing. The big test is how that or whether that starts to change, say, textbook surveys or classroom surveys, right? And I see that as a teacher, that sometimes it's hard sometimes to know where to fit in some of these transnational stories into standard national survey classes, for example, like Intro to American History. Other questions? Oh, Brian.
So
Yes.
prior to the Boundary Commission doing its work, how do people know where the border was?
There's that border marker. Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that. So this is the only place that the border had really been surveyed. It had been surveyed at a couple points at Pembina, which is in the Red River Valley, so where the Red River crosses the 49th parallel, and now North Dakota and Manitoba. And there's a series of surveyors. In fact, there were rival fur trading posts. Initially the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company that sort of camped out on either side, and eventually Hudson's Bay Company and American Fur Company posts. And periodically disputes over where that boundary was, and the heated fur trade competitions in the 1820s and 30s led the Army to go out and do surveys. But that survey was really not very extensive and apparently fraught with all kinds of errors that they found out in the 1870s as well. So you had this border post that had GB, Great Britain, carved on one side, eventually got swung around. But that was it. And so, and even after the survey, so the survey, I don't have any photos here, but they go in 1870 and they leave those earthen markers, at intervals all across the plains, but within a few years those have worn down from the elements. And it becomes a real problem because, one of the things people were called on in Canada in particular, the Métis had to describe where they were in 1870, and they had to prove in order to get claims to land in Canada that they were in Canada in 1870. How do you do that, right? So you see in their applications where they say, give little narratives of where they were, descriptions of landscapes and things like that. Well, I was at Wood Mountain, and we all knew Wood Mountain to be north of the boundary. So there was a kind of understanding of some of the geographic markers and where they sat, but no formal presence. And really, to this day, until 2001, I mean, that border was very much easy to miss. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brendan.
Can you trace some of this history a few years further, just really briefly, into the number treaties
Yeah.
and the 1885 Northwest Rebellion? How does this all
Yeah.
lead into that? Or
Right.
does it lead into
It does. Yeah, thank you. So what I gave you here, and it's hard to know what to do with a talk like this, so I really gave you a chapter here, a part of a chapter. And so the story from the 1870s, the book follows that story through into the turn of the 20th century. And what I try and trace afterwards is how really the process of border marking, and so that's both the enforcement of the actual national boundary, but also the enforcement of other sort of boundaries of reservations, treaties, and non-treaty, how that starts to exert a profound effect on Métis communities. So that by 1881, there are very few buffalo left, and the military campaigns have essentially expelled these borderland communities. And Métis find themselves on either side of the border and trying to find a new way of life after the buffalo. And so for many people, that causes them to look to enter treaty, for example, or to join reservation communities in the United States. So part of the conversation that I trace is how do the Métis navigate those boundaries, and how do people see them in terms of are they British, Canadian, American, are they Indian, are they white? And how people answer those questions becomes really important because it determines whether they can vote, whether they can take a homestead, whether they can join a treaty, and all these sorts of things. So the project attempts to sort that out in those intervening in the years that follow, I should say. And 1885, I should say, is a pivot point in many ways, because it's the second Métis resistance and becomes a real turning point in Canada, and after which Métis communities were deeply fractured. And I show how that continued. Just as the Plains Wars were felt in Canada, I try and show how the Northwest Rebellion was felt in the United States as well. Yes?
Would you say that the Métis settled more north of the border in Canada as compared to
Yeah.
most of America?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that there are good reasons why these histories aren't as familiar, south of the border as in Canada, in part because the communities in Canada were much, much larger, remain much larger. They have a different legal status. They have a different history, a much more prominent history. And in the United States, although the first map I showed you with the arrows doesn't do it justice, some of these communities were always south of the 49th parallel, but there were never as many as there were to the north. So that's a really important reason for that imbalance.